first of all, could you introduce yourself and explain a little bit about who you are?
Sure. My name is Forman. I'm the owner of H. Forman and Son. And this business was started by my great-grandfather back in 1905. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been claiming that we are the world's oldest producer of smoked salmon. And nobody has said to me, no, you're not Mr. Forman, so I suspect it must be true.
So well, how did your is it your great-great? No.
Great-grandfather, 4 generations.
How did he come to start the whole thing up in the first place? What was the story?
So my great-granddad came from Odessa in Russia, or Ukraine. He was a Jewish immigrant fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, settled in London's East End, and there was a wave of Jewish immigration to the UK at that time. And he and others like him were smoking salmon because it was a way of preserving fish. There was very little refrigeration in those days, and it was something they were familiar with. And in the very early days, he didn't even realise there was a salmon native to Britain. So he would ship over salmon from the Baltic, it would arrive in barrels of salt water, and that's what he would smoke for his own sort of community in the East End. And it was only when he went to the fish market at Billingsgate and saw these beautiful wild salmon coming down from Scotland and thought, why don't we just use the local fish, it'll be a lot easier. And he started smoking the Scottish salmon, and the product was just so amazing. People fell in love with it, and it took off. And I would say that smoked salmon, and what we today refer to as London Cure smoked salmon, became Britain's first ever homegrown gourmet food.
So was it not happening before then? It wasn't really a thing, and no one really knew?
No, it's, yes, I mean the Scots have a history of smoking fish, Arbroath smokies, fin and haddock, and salmon to some extent. Kippers, obviously. But if you think about all those fish, they tend to be very, very smoky. Now, if you were a chef putting on a 5-course banquet, you'd never start the meal with a kipper because you're going to taste it after the chocolate pudding 5 courses later. And what chefs loved about London Cure smoked salmon was that it was a very delicate thing. The smoking wasn't there to flavour the fish, the smoking was there to preserve it. So what you do is you take the salmon fillet, or you take the salmon, you fillet it, then you sprinkle the salmon fillet with salt, you leave it for 24 hours, and the salt draws out all the moisture, and that's how you start to preserve it. You then air dry it, so you have these fans just blowing warm air over the fish to draw out more moisture, and as it dries, it becomes quite tacky and sticky. That's when you release the smoke, and the smoke sticks to the outside of the fillet and it creates a seal on the outside. And if they had vacuum packing 100 years ago, they might never have smoked it, but they didn't. So the smoke was the seal, and that meant that you could just hang the fish, the smoked salmon, in a cold larder, and it would just stay, protected, because that smoky seal was a barrier. Before you then eat the fish, the very first thing you do is you trim off that outer layer to reveal this concentrated salmon flavour, so the smoky stuff was removed. And so London Cure smoked salmon is very delicate, and it made a great starter course. You'd have that, and then you move on to the next course, and so on.
And then so he obviously started doing it with his friends and like their community, and then how did that grow into a bigger thing? And so was there like one particular thing that was like the break that then kind of sort of started?
Well, having discovered the Scottish salmon, and using that fish, because the flavour was just so incredible, he started hawking it around in places like the Savoy and Selfridges. We've been supplying Selfridges for over 100 years. And people fell in love with this product, and as I say, smoked salmon was born, and it was the marriage. So a lot of people think it's an ancient Scottish tradition, and it's not. It was the fish that came from Scotland, but the smoking was done in East London. And if you think about other gourmet foods around the turn of the 20th century, things like foie gras and truffles and caviar, they were coming into the UK from other parts of the world, but smoked salmon was born here in the East End of London. Sadly, over the last 20 to 30 years, a lot of the industry's changed, and it's become very, very mass-produced. And the nature of the product has changed. And a lot of it now, because it's all done on, trying to make it as cheaply as possible, the techniques have changed. And it's, we lose about 20 to 30% of the weight of the fillets just by taking out all that moisture to preserve the fish. But when you're selling fish by the kilo, if you can sell water for the price of salmon, it's very good business, but it makes the fish very slimy. So a lot of modern producers now try to keep the water in, so they brine the fish, they inject it with salt water, and so on. And we often, often consumers that aren't familiar with how smoked salmon used to be are actually put off by smoked salmon nowadays. They find it slimy, they don't like the texture. Sometimes they find it just way too smoky, and they often say, 2 or 3 hours later they eat 20 peppermint chewing gums to get rid of the taste of the smoke. But that's not how smoked salmon is meant to be, or how it should be.
So how have your techniques changed over the time, or have they not particularly changed that much?
They haven't changed at all, and indeed that's why we believe we have survived. It's interesting, it's sort of counterintuitive, but we haven't modernised. When salmon farming started, you started to see, a lot of government money was given to this new industry, a lot of grant money was given, and you started to see all these modern factories springing up around the coasts of, Scotland and other parts of the country, a lot of innovation in sort of mechanisation and so on. And all the traditional smokehouses in East London, and there would have been about a dozen of them, even as late as the 1970s, all tried to compete with this new industry. And they couldn't compete, they went out of business. We are the last surviving of those original smokehouses because we didn't try and compete. We just carried on doing things in a very old-fashioned way. And it's quite lucky for us, really, that over the last probably 15 years, people have become much more interested in food provenance and traditional food methods. And it's not, we don't do things traditionally just because we're sort of Luddites and we don't want change, but the product is just so much better. And when we do consumer events and we're standing there with a side of smoked salmon carving tasters, offering people, quite often their first reaction is, oh no, I don't want to try it because they've been put off smoked salmon. But when we encourage them to taste it, they go, oh my God, that's, if I knew it tasted like that, I would never have said no in the first place. They love it. It was one of the great gourmet foods, and it still should be if it's done properly.
So what's I don't know if you know that kind of percentage, but how much of the market would you say is the sort of new, not so traditionally done salmon, and how much of the market is?
I'd say 99% of it is the modern methods. Now, it's not just in the UK, the USA, across Europe, and people have actually got used to the modern methods. And it's interesting, when we look at reviews of our own product on, shopping sites and so on, and you read the reviews, I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, people will say, this smoked salmon is fantastic, these people really know what they're doing, but every now and again you'll get a remark saying, I can't see what's so great about it, I can't taste the smoke. And you're not meant to taste the smoke, but people have become familiar with the sort of the cheaper, modern mass production smoked salmon.
And what about export? How much do you export of your salmon, or is it mainly, where's the majority of your
Most
salmon?
of what we're doing is in the UK, but we do export about 15%. At one stage it was a bit more, but it's grown again now. And most of it, I would say, goes to the USA, some into Europe, but we've exported to Hong Kong for over 40 years. We're now exporting into mainland China as well. But literally all corners of the corners of the earth.
So how labour intensive is it? How many people does it take to do it? And how many salmon do you get through it? What's the measurements?
The way we do it, obviously we have a lot more staff involved than the modern mechanised ways of doing it. So we are literally doing every single step of it by hand. We're hand splitting the salmon, chopping the head and the tail off, chopping the fish in half. We hand salt it, we're hanging the fish on racks. We're taking every single little pin bone we take out with a pair of tweezers. I worked out that since we've been in business, we've probably taken out about 1 billion bones, literally by tweezer. We hand slice it, we hand pack it. And that means that you have an expert at every single step of the way, quality controlling the product. 99% of it now is mass produced. If you look at most of these factories, they have it's conveyor belt driven, people mindlessly plonking bits of fish onto a conveyor belt. And once you do that, you've lost the passion for the product and quality goes out the window. No slice of our salmon is left without some expert having quality controlled every single slice. But when you just feed it through a machine, you're dealing with a natural product, but nobody knows what's inside that product. You could have bad fish or whatever, you'll never know.
Well, were you as a child? Did you already know? Was this already your destiny from birth? Did you kind of grow up as a kid? Were you in the factory, ran the factory, or did you rebel against it and then come back? How did your path go?
That's a good question. Well, I learnt because 50 years ago there was no such thing as vacuum packing of smoked salmon. So if you wanted to buy it somewhere, you'd have to go to a deli and they'd carve it in front of you. So I was taught to carve smoked salmon at the age of 6. My dad would bring home a side every weekend, and I'd be sort of carving it at a very young age. A bit dangerous. I'm sure health and safety nowadays with a very sharp knife would probably not allow that. But during school holidays, as I was growing up, I would come into the business. As soon as I passed my driving test, my dad sent me on deliveries, making deliveries to all these sort of famous restaurants and hotels. So I grew up with it, but I didn't know I was definitely going to come into the business, and certainly there was no overt pressure for me to come into the business. It's unusual for a fourth generation business to survive. Normally, after the third generation, they go into decline. That's quite a typical pattern. But we're the fourth, so we're not sure if the cycle starts again or the decline carries on. My wife and I we have 3 children. We haven't put pressure on our children to come into the business, and to some extent we thought if we don't put pressure on them, they might rebel and want to do it, but they've actually taken us seriously, which I'm not sure is a great idea. So the succession planning hasn't quite worked out yet, but we will see what happens.
And there are like lots, I imagine there's probably like lots of stories that get passed down, like stories around your grandfather and your father and your grandfather. Is there like sort of certain stories that are like, oh, everyone in the family knows this story's going to come out? You know, is there like the typical stories of things that have happened over the years?
There, of course, over the years there are so many different stories. I mean, in my own 25-year lifetime in the business, we went through a period of 5 years, a few years after I joined, where we had a series of absolutely catastrophic crises: a fire, followed by a flood, followed by a compulsory purchase, where we were forced to relocate our entire factory, which had only just been built, out of what is now the running track at the Olympic Stadium. But there are good stories and bad stories. One of the sort of family myths, whether it's a myth or true, we don't know. It was never written down. But was my grandfather was quite friendly with the founder of Tesco, Jack Cohen, and apparently lent him a fiver to open his first market stall in Wells Street Market in the East End, which is very close to here actually. And of course we all joke in the family, what a shame it was a loan and not an equity stake. But who knows? I mean, there are some great stories. Of course, it's an interesting business that's gone on for a long time.
And as an expert, what would you tell people, what's the best way to eat salmon? Because there's also, what should you have it with, what should you accompany it with?
It's really interesting you asked that question actually, because of course everyone has their own favourite ways. Literally 2 weeks ago, we did a survey of all our own online customers. We have, a few tens of thousands of online customers, and we actually said to them, look, we send you all the smoked salmon quite regularly. How do you like to eat it, best of all? And the 3 most popular ways, and it was pretty evenly balanced actually, was one very classically, just literally on some thin brown bread, lots of butter, just very simple. Another third said they love it with scrambled eggs. Not necessarily the avocado, but that's become very fashionable now. So, but scrambled eggs and smoked salmon very popular. And other people said just on a plate with a squeeze of lemon. We generally, when we're promoting and discussing smoked salmon, we generally avoid the lemon, not because we have any problems with lemons, we don't, but people have got very used to squeezing lemon on smoked salmon because so much of it nowadays is very fatty and sort of oily and slimy, and the lemon you need that to cut through that. If the quality of the smoked salmon is really good, you don't need the lemon. But of course, if you like the taste of citrus and lemon, there's nothing wrong with that.
And just for, obviously all the people that we go out to, they're not all in the UK. What should people be looking for if they're going to buy it? Like, what are the sort of tips of if people are looking to get something that's good quality? How is there certain sort of tests and things they should be looking for?
They should be looking for our brand, of course. Forman smoked salmon, London Cure smoked salmon, of course. An easy sign actually is if you look at the ingredients labels on the back, there should never be sugar in smoked salmon. There are 2 ingredients, salmon and salt. That's it. But most producers add sugar nowadays, and the reason they add sugar, well, there are a few reasons, but one of the main reasons they add sugar is because the smoked salmon is so smoky, and smoke is actually quite bitter. So if you add sugar, it takes away the bitterness of the smoke. Some of them add sugar because they add too much salt, because they want to extend the shelf life. It makes it easier for a retailer to sell it if they've got more time to sell it. And then when it's too salty, which is quite unhealthy, it tastes too salty, they use the sugar to counterbalance the additional salt. But there should never be sugar in smoked salmon. Some people often say, when it's got those white, stripy, veiny lines, is that bad quality or not? And it's not. It's just a personal preference. When you have a fillet of salmon, when you have a side of smoked salmon, different parts of the fish taste different. It's like when you have a roast chicken, different parts of the chicken, the breast tastes different to the wings and the leg and so on. They all taste different. It's the same with a side of smoked salmon. The top slices tend to be a bit leaner and drier, maybe a little bit saltier because that's where you sprinkle the salt. As you get through the fish, the fish tends to be a bit oilier and a bit more succulent. And it's really personal preference. And again, we've surveyed our customers on that. A few years ago we did it. We had over 2,000 responses. And it was really interesting. 48% of the customers said they preferred the salmon fatty. and 52% said they preferred it lean. It's just like the Brexit vote. We weren't sure if the leaners were the levers. They might have been. We don't know. But it's really balanced. You know, it's just personal preference. So the stripy line doesn't mean it's inferior quality. It's just a slice from a different part of the fish.
Cool. Thank you. I'm trying to think if there's a missing thing. Actually, can you just tell us what stage these, just as we've got a whole lot of salmon hanging behind us,
Okay.
what they're doing here and what stage they're at? What this?
Okay. So here we have a side of smoked salmon, literally as it's come out of the kilns. So the salmon has been filleted, obviously, and cured in salt. And the salt stays on the fish for up to 24 hours, and that draws out somewhere between 5 to 10% of the moisture. We then hang that fillet in the kiln. It loses another 10% of its moisture. And then as it's drying and smoking, this crusty surface, this sort of hard leathery surface, it's called the pellicle, starts to form, and that is what protects the fish. And as you can see, we leave these bones in, the rib cage and these fin bones and the little pin bones. You know, if you run your finger along there, you feel every single little bone. And we leave those fish. You should smoke the fish on the bones like cooking meat on the bone. You get a better product. And then before you slice the salmon, the first thing you do is you have to trim all this off to reveal the beautiful slices underneath. Again, what most producers do nowadays, they don't want to waste that crusty bit. That's about another 8% of the weight of the fillet. So what they do is they take all the bones out before it's smoked, and then the crust forms across the entire fillet, and they feed the whole thing through a slicing machine which sort of slices it like this, and you get that little chewy, crusty edge on every slice. It saves them about 8 to 10%, but you get this sort of smoky, chewy crust, and it's ruining the good name of smoked salmon. This is how it should be. Ideally, smoked salmon should be carved as close to the time of eating as possible. It will just taste better, because once you remove this protective crust, that's when the air starts to get into the fish and it starts, the deterioration starts. So this is like a protective seal.
So how quickly after you slice them does it go out?
Daily. I mean, we are literally producing smoked salmon freshly every day, 6 days a week. It comes out of our kilns at 3:30 in the morning, and it goes straight to restaurants, caterers, hotels, food stores that same day. A lot of people think that smoked salmon has a much longer shelf life because it's smoked, and of course it has a longer shelf life than fresh salmon, but it's still deteriorating all the time. So all you're doing by smoking it is you're slowing down the rate of deterioration. But freshly smoked salmon will taste better than smoked salmon that's a few weeks old.